I used to tease my husband that his kindness was a reflex, like a horse flicking at flies. He did it without planning, without polishing, and certainly without announcing it. Clay would tip his hat to the quietest things: a neighbor's broken gate hinge, a soldier's mama trying to back a trailer, a stranger whose map app sent her to the wrong section road in a county where roads and fences don't always agree. He'd ease his truck to the shoulder, say, "Morning, ma'am," as if morning itself had asked him to keep it company and get to work. The day that matters most to this story began lean and blue. Late November, the kind of West Texas morning that means business. The sky was so clear it made your eyes work. We were headed out before sunup to check the north tanks and salt the remote pasture. Cattle will follow salt the way we follow coffee. A sliver of moon hung like a cuff button someone forgot to secure. The mesquite looked frosted, even without a cloud in sight. On the dash between the cracked cowhide Bible and a roll of baling wire, I balanced 2 thermoses and a sack of breakfast tacos wrapped in foil. Clay kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the world, somehow always aware when a coyote meant mischief or a windmill meant trouble. At mile 6, we saw hazard lights blinking like small red prayers in the ditch. A stock trailer sat cockeyed on a rusted Ford half-ton. The rear axle sank mean in caliche. One tire gone to rags, the rim biting dirt like it had a grudge. A dun mare stood quiet in the trailer, ribs showing the truth of a long week. A woman about 30, brown hair in a braid, jaw set like a person who's used to finishing what she starts, stood with a little boy in a red hoodie and a girl maybe 12. The boy's mitten was clenched around a dog's leash, and the dog had the careful look of a shepherd who knows the room is not his to command, but is willing to usher the day anyway. Clay slowed. Of course he slowed. He rolled down the window before we even stopped and called, "Y'all okay?" "We will be," the woman said, breath fogging, "if I can figure out how to conjure a tire out of thin air." Her voice had sand in it and warmth, the way good soil looks when you turn it with a shovel, gritty but promising. The girl tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and stood tall in her hunger. The boy held the dog closer, and the dog wagged once like a gentleman. We had a spare that would fit, same 6-lug bolt pattern, because Clay is the sort of man who counts bolt patterns the way some people count blessings. He flicked his eyes toward me, a question and an answer in one. I nodded and dug for the jack. In 15 minutes, we had the axle up, the lug nuts in my pocket, the old tire off. Clay worked with that prayerful economy men develop when they've lost a few foolish fights to time and learned to keep their breathing in order. The woman introduced herself between thanks. "Alma," she said. "Kids are Sage and Lila, mare's Pepita. We're headed to a day-work job south of Sweetwater. If we can get there before they hire the next desperate family that rolls up." Clay didn't offer charity words. He offered the kind that earned their keep. "This rim's chewed on, 30 miles of washboard, and she'll talk back. You got a little time to spare?" Alma shrugged, a gesture that was half courage and half capitulation. "Time I've got. Money not so much." "Time'll do," Clay said. "Follow us. We'll swap that rim for one of mine out at the shop, and I'll send you on with a spare so you can make your job. You can mail me the replacement when you land steady." "You don't know me," Alma said, not suspicious, just announcing a fact in a world that sometimes needs reminding. "I know this country," Clay said. "It's hard. That's enough." We crept the truck and trailer the 4 miles to the yard, the dun mare riding quiet like she'd decided for everyone that panic was cancelled. At the shop, Clay found a take-off rim, straight and true, rubber decent, and set to work. I warmed tortillas on the shop stove and handed tacos into children's hands and watched their cheeks untense, the way a rope goes slack when the cow quits pulling. Alma tried to pay for the gas Clay siphoned into her tank. He took the bills, folded them once and slipped them back under the rubber band around her registration papers. "You'll need it for the next thing," he said. "There's always a next thing." Before they pulled out, Alma asked, "Why?" Clay shrugged, that old cowboy gesture that means everything and nothing. "Somebody pulled me out of a ditch once," he said, And a preacher I barely knew showed up when my daddy died with the right kind of quiet. And a woman named May, he hooked a thumb toward me, said yes to a broke man with a broke truck and a full heart. You'd be surprised how much of a life can be run on small yeses. Alma's mouth did a thing I've learned to love on tough women, bent up in one corner like a door that needs oil, then softened into a real smile. She reached across and touched Clay's forearm, precise and grateful. "I'll remember," she said. She did, as it turned out, but I am getting ahead of myself. That wasn't the only small kindness Clay scattered that month. There was the boy at the auction barn trying to lead an old gelding out of a kill pen by pulling hard enough to make anyone cry. Clay stepped in, put a hand on the lead, and taught the boy to breathe slow, to lower his shoulder, to ask instead of insist. They walked out of the pen together, and Clay paid the extra 30 the buyer demanded like a troll fee on a bridge you shouldn't have to cross. "That horse will carry your mistakes if you promise to learn fast," he told the boy. "That's all any of us can ask of the day." There was the farrier June, whose truck battery died in our driveway of all places. Clay got her jumped, and while cables did their work, he listened to her talk about how men at some barns ignored her and women at others doubted her. And in the end, both hired the guy who smiled at the right angle. He hired her on the spot for our string and then told half the county she was the best shoe he'd seen in a decade. "If I tell it, it's because it's true," he'd say when she embarrassed. There was Mr. Salas, the retired math teacher with a half-acre behind the school, who grew beans like a man who loved practical miracles. His pump seized up. Clay pulled it apart on our picnic table and handed it back working. "You keep the kids in beans," he said. "That's my return." Those were the sorts of things Clay did, and we didn't keep score because we weren't playing a game. We just lived like folks who understood that there are gears in a county that grind if you don't oil them with your hands. If you'd told me that month that any of it would come back around in a way that would change our winter, I would have smiled and quoted my mother, "That's not why you do it." We didn't do it for later. We did it because right now is a place that needs tending. A week after Alma and Pepita rattled out of our gate, the wind came up wild from the north and brought a taste of sleet you could feel in your teeth. The weatherman said blue norther, the way they do here with half warning, half ritual. That night at 11, we lost a stretch of fence behind the west tank when an old cottonwood let go like a man who's finally done apologizing. Clay and our hand, Buddy, hustled out with headlamps and post mauls. I wrapped sandwiches in wax paper and stood at the doorway listening to metal sing in the cold. We got most of the cows pushed back east by 3 a.m. And we slept in our clothes because sleep is just a truce in this life. Nobody mistakes it for victory. Morning brought a sullen grey and the kind of cold that makes calves look small again. We salt-blocked the south pasture, checked the windmill by mile 10, sulking but pumping, and came home to stew. The radio mumbled about historic lows by Thursday. Clay's face did that still thing it does when he's populating a plan with details. He poured coffee and said, "We need them stacked in bull draw by Wednesday night. Windbreak hay, water deep enough not to lock." Stacked is a word that suits cattle when weather plans to argue. You want them where you can hold them, grass, shelter, feed, fence that won't roll over. Only problem, we had 3 sections worth of cows, scattered more than I liked, 2 good horses in shape, 1 old man, Clay, though he'd bristle at the word, with a hip that predicted rain like a barometer, a hand with a cough, and me, May, with more will than wind. We could do it, just not at the speed a Blue Norther consults. Clay wrote a list like he was laying shingles. Fix the west span, move the south herd to the creek, check the float valves, cut ice, pre-stage hay, call Frank about his portable panels, text June, say a prayer to St. Joseph who never minded being asked for practical things. He took the last sip of coffee and stood. "Sun up," he said, and we both nodded, the way people in long marriages nod when they remember their joint account with work. We turned in early, the house cracking a little in the cold. I tell you all this because if you only heard the end, the thunder of hoofbeats and the way horizon turned into help, you might think it was a fairy tale. It wasn't. It was the truest math I know. You put small kindness out into a country that keeps score in strange ledgers, and sometimes, when the ledger needs balancing, it sends you a sunrise you could never have afforded. We did not know yet what had been set in motion by a rim and a rope lesson and a rebuilt pump. We just knew cold was coming. We set our alarms for 4:30 and laid out our wool like armor. Clay kissed my forehead. I touched the scar on his knuckle, where a T-post had once reminded him that haste is a mean teacher. We slept, but lightly, like people who trust the morning but also double-check it. Dawn, in a cold snap, makes a sound if you're listening. The first crackle of ice at the tank, the moan of wire when a post gives up a fraction of an inch, lowing like someone negotiating with the day. I slipped out of bed into boots I'd left by the heater and grabbed the thermoses, the sack of biscuits, the little jar of honey I keep for bad mornings. Clay was already at the table, tying a scarf in that old vaquero knot Frank taught him 40 years ago. Ends tucked, no nonsense. "Buddy texted," he said, shrugging into his coat. "He's puking. Could be that gas station burrito. Could be that he's a fool who thought a hoodie counts as layers." I winced for Buddy and for us. "I'll saddle Dolly. You take Rooster. We'll work the south herd first." We stepped outside into a cold that made your eyelashes crisp. The stars looked close enough to brush lint off. I smelled cedar smoke from our neighbor's place and thanked every ancestor who ever taught farm people to stack wood before they needed it. The horses, capital H as always, gave us their good morning snorts and the judgment they reserve for cold leather. Rooster, Clay's sorrel with a heart bigger than his head, took the bit like a gentleman. Dolly, my blue roan mare, rolled an eye as if to say, I had other plans, but okay. We swung up, and for a second, the home place looked like a postcard. Porchlight, frost like glitter without the sin, the shape of our lives drawn clean. Then we rode, and postcards quit, and practicality took over. By 7 we were cutting a seam through the south pasture, pushing the bunch toward the creek, where the cottonwoods make a God's own windbreak. Cattle in cold want you to be decisive. They read your shoulders, your breath, your history. Clay rode out wide, and I sat in that half seat that lets you move without argument. We picked up 20 head, then 50, then 80. A heifer took a notion to hang up at the tank, and Dolly spoke to her with a little hip language. The heifer considered the conversation and decided to rejoin society. I like a mare who makes a point without a scene. We had 100-some tucked by 10 and were headed back for the stragglers when the radio crackled in my coat pocket. I fished it out with the clumsy love one reserves for tools that have saved your life before. "This is Clay," he said into his, and I answered, "May." The voice that came through wasn't Buddy's or Frank's or the weatherman's. It was June, the farrier, voice bright like a coffee you didn't have to pay for. "Y'all at the south pasture?" "Affirmative," Clay said, because he likes to pretend a radio makes him official. "Stay put for a minute," she said. "I'm 5 out. Brought a friend." What friend?" I asked, but she'd already let go the button. Clay and I exchanged a look. In our language, a look can carry whole paragraphs. "Do we have time for this?" "We don't not have time for this." "What if it's a broken trailer?" "We'll fix it fast. Lord, make this useful." We didn't wait long for the answer. What we heard first was diesel, the throatier kind that says someone is hauling something worth hauling. Then the shape of a stock trailer eased through the gate like it had been invited last night. A white dually I recognized as June's rolled to a stop, and behind it a shorter rig with a hand-painted sign on the door that made me grin. Alma and Sage, day work. June swung down in her orange cap, her grin already on. Alma stepped out with her braid tucked into a wool cap, and behind her, a kid of maybe 19 with rope-burned gloves and the serious eyes of someone keeping a promise to himself. "You said friend, not friends," Clay said, dismounting, but his voice had the smile I love best, surprised and pleased to be. "Turns out I had more than one," June said. "Ran into Alma at the feed store last week. She was shooing cash with me in the parking lot because the grid was down inside. Told her you'd put a rim under her when the world was thinking of forgetting her. told her you had a norther coming and a hand down. She said, "Tell me when and where." So I did. Alma touched the brim of her cap. "Coyotes told me to bring a pen," she said, deadpan, then cracked a real grin. "We brought ourselves instead." Before any of us could get soft, a second sound stitched the horizon. Hoofbeats, plural, not the two we'd made, not the three we were making now, but many, like a plan someone else had made on our behalf. I turned in the saddle toward the section road and saw shapes coming clean out of the east, horses with steam for manes, riders with scarves and silhouettes that make every Western cliché look suddenly shy. It is not often a person sees the horizon deliver friends. My breath hitched like a screen door in wind. In the lead, Frank, old and happy on a horse with a resume. Flanking him, the Morales brothers from south of town, cowboys who can build a fence straight with their eyes closed. Behind them, half the 4-H club, kids in hand-me-down chaps and borrowed felt hats, whooping not because it's a movie, but because teenagers have lungs, and it is the right kind of cold to use them. There was Mr. Salas in a borrowed coat. He doesn't ride much anymore, but he came to drive the feed truck, his beans having taught him patience. There was the retired sheriff on his grey, the one he keeps fat on principle. There was the pastor from Second Baptist, who can sit a trot like a man born to it, because grief and joy have both thrown him, and he refused to quit. There was even the ranch realtor whose suit I'd only ever seen in town. Today he wore denim that knew its business, and weaving among them like someone born onto a rhythm instead of a saddle, 3 women from the chapter house west of us, braids tucked, eyes sharp, riding horses that made a person want to stand up and salute. They didn't bunch around us and make a fuss. They split without instruction, as if the pasture itself whispered assignments. June pointed to a patch behind us. "Those old girls will try to peel off. I'll sit that gate." Alma gestured to her kid. Sage, I guessed, in his serious gloves. "You and Lila," a young woman his age, stepped up from Alma's rig, whip-smart eyes on a chestnut mare. Dragged lightly on the left. Low voices. No heroics. Frank lifted 3 fingers. Our old sign for, "We'll haze them and block the creek," then turned with his men and became motion. Clay looked at me like a man embarrasses himself with gratitude if he keeps it in. He squeezed my knee with a gloved hand that could still transmit warmth. "We thought we were 2, he said under his breath. "Turns out we were many," I said, "and I am not a woman who says poetic things for sport." The morning became a map we didn't have to draw. Riders moved where gaps might show up. Kids learned the art of being useful without being loud. Dolly and Rooster found their tempo with horses who had never met them and instantly understood the job. Someone, I think it was the retired sheriff, showed up with a chainsaw and opened a path where a mesquite had surrendered at a bad angle. Mr. Salas took the feed truck along the fence at a slow, even pace, singing something under his breath that could have been a hymn or a multiplication table. June threw a shoe on a heifer who thought he had it easy and rolled his ankle. She did it standing, rope looped to a T-post, smooth as water. At one point, a young steer took off for the wrong country the way young creatures do when they believe in their own ideas. The 4-H kids followed like a Greek chorus, over-enthusiastic but eager. Alma's Lila slid out in a tight crescent, cut the steer's angle by wearing her horse-like intention, and eased him back toward a more sensible life without scaring him into stubbornness. I watched and thought, good, let the land have this generation in its hands a while. We worked without thinking of hours because clocks get embarrassed around work that matters. We put 180 cows and calves into bull draw before lunch, then another 120 by 3. The wind rose wicked at 5 and tasted like a fight. Alma thought ahead and had Sage and Lila string a line of flakes from the haystack to the creek, a breadcrumb trail for cows to follow if their nerve failed at dusk. The Morales brothers rebuilt a gate so true I wanted to hang a picture on it. Frank leaned on his horn and laughed at a story the retired sheriff told that I will not repeat here because a lady wrote this and you know enough to fill in the adjectives. The pastor prayed once, quietly, for the calf that didn't make it, and nobody mocked that because some prayers are just housekeeping for the soul. We had them stacked by dark, as Clay intended. The line riders, those with the stamina to sit a fence all night to discourage ideas, took shifts. The kids got sent home with cocoa in paper cups and faces that will remember this day better than any prom. I set a vat of chili on a propane burner in the shed and ladled it into anything that would hold heat. Thermoses, disposable bowls, the mismatched mugs that seem to multiply in ranch kitchens the way cats do. We ate standing up, which is sometimes the sweetest way to eat when you have earned fatigue down to the bone. I found Clay by the corral with Rooster's head under his arm. He had that look that belongs on men who've kept something together that threatened to come apart. It is not pride. It is relief, gratitude, and the particular humility of a man who knows he didn't do it alone. How? He asked me, not because he didn't know, but because sometimes love wants to hear the list. I put my hand on his chest because I know where his steadiness lives. A rim, I said. A rope lesson, a pump rebuilt, a phone call from June, a county that saw you hold without counting. He nodded. And a wife who can plan chili for an army without a committee. You're sweet when you're frozen, I said, and we laughed the kind of laugh that breaks ice off a soul. We settled the last details with a handful of "you good" and "I've got it" and "see you at 2 for the switch." The sky had a hard glitter to it, stars meaning what they say. In the distance, on the hill above the creek, I could make out the dark backs of cattle, fromers full of hay, breath-making little fog ghosts that vanished without consequence. The world had the decency to be quiet for a minute. That's when I heard it, not diesel, not hooves, not wind, but the smallest sound, like gratitude clearing its throat. It might have been a calf resettling. It might have been my heart. It doesn't matter. What mattered is what came the next morning, because trouble wasn't done, and neither were we. And the sunrise that followed, well, that was when kindness rode back wearing spurs and a serious face. We slept in shifts that night, the house a way station for heat and coffee. I dozed in the chair by the back door, Clay on the couch with his hand still curled like he held a rein. At 2 a.m., June texted "lines solid" and a picture of her boots on the bottom rung of a panel, frost lace making beauty on ugliness. At 4, Frank radioed that wind had drifted a mean patch of snow across the section road by the east gate. Snow in November, like a bully showing up early. "We'll need chains," he said, and I heard in his voice that he had already dragged someone out of a place they didn't belong. At 5, the thermometer on the porch had the nerve to tell us 7 degrees. "That's not a temperature, that's a dare," I muttered, pulling on a second pair of socks. Clay laughed without humor and reached for his scarf. "We'll check ice," he said. "Cut it before the sun makes liars of it." We stepped outside into a blue that looked like the sky forgot its light. Cold eats sound, but not completely. It leaves in place certain noises that insist, the grant of a windmill pretending it's older than it is, the stiff rattle of the cottonwood that thinks it's still a young man, the hush of cattle shifting their weight like the world's slowest boat. We walked to the shed to fetch axes and salt and found, leaned against the door, 3 things. A stack of de-icer blocks I hadn't ordered, a pair of new chains in sizes that fit our tires, and a cardboard box with "For May" written in Sharpie. Inside, 2 wool neck gaiters, a hand warmer, and a note in block letters, "Standard issue from the 4-H brats." I laughed out loud and wiped my eyes with a glove that smelled like work. At the tank, we cut ice like surgeons in a field hospital, delicate in a hurry. Clay's blade met the surface with a satisfying crack, and then another, and a little tide of black water rolled up like greeting. We cleared a circle 2 feet across, then another, then laid branches to keep it honest. Rooster bumped my shoulder with his nose, in case I had forgotten that horses are opinions with feet. I gave him a cookie from my pocket, because I prefer kindness even in bribery. When the east showed the first insult of light, a thin grey you could argue with, I heard what I will tell and tell until I'm old enough to want to repeat myself. Hoofbeats, many, on frozen ground. It is a particular music, 4-beat, 4-foot, hindfoot, multiplied by a dozen, by 20, by more, until the air remembers that people used to arrive this way. I turned and saw them come over the rise like the morning had decided to bring its own parade. Riders shoulder to shoulder, not in show formation, but in usefulness, with saddle blankets peeking out like quilts, scarves in colours somebody's grandmother chose, faces set to work. At the front, Alma again, this time with 5 behind her, all in that efficient day-hand uniform of thrift store wool and well-kept tack. To her right, 2 tribal riders I didn't know yesterday and can't imagine forgetting now. Their horses stepped out smooth, their eyes scanning fence for failure. June was back, of course, with a second farrier, whose name I learned later was Becca, who had a smile like someone who knows she can fix things and prefers not to announce it. Mr. Salas came in the feed truck, the 4-H kids hanging off the sides like barnacled teenagers, waving like flags, their mothers behind them in SUVs full of thermoses and blankets and the sorts of first aid that matter, not to say the least, sandwiches. The retired sheriff had recruited 3 of his former deputies who had horseflesh and a day off. The pastor brought 2 deacons with strong backs and gentle hands. Frank had, God help us, found the realtor again, who had traded denim for coveralls and looked less like a man selling sunsets and more like a man used to seeing them. They didn't wait for instructions. They took them. Clay pointed north and made a chopping motion. Heifers there, fence line to check. Alma nodded and took 2. Sage behind her quick, Lila on their flank. June pointed to the west, tapped her wrist. Time sensitive. Becca peeled left with the chainsaw and a kid with arms like hopes. The tribal riders chose the ridge. Wind hits there, drift forms, without being told. The deacons hauled hay along a trail we'd set yesterday, doubling it with a grace that made deacon not a church word but a person word. If you are reading this and thinking, well, that's nice, but it's just people doing what people do, then let me ask you, when's the last time the Horizon delivered this many? Because that morning it did, and not because we posted a sign-up sheet or wrote a grant or staged a feel-good photo. It came because small kindness had circulated like groundwater, quiet, persistent, and now the aquifer rose. The first choice they made was to set the old and the cold to jobs that conserve heat and usefulness. Mr. Salas and the other older men stayed with trucks and gates and tools. The kids rode where the sun could find them first. Frank, who knows every weak point a fence can sulk from, took 2 loops of wire and went hunting trouble like a man with a warrant. The women set their eyes on calves, the littles, as Alma called them, who needed moving into the windbreaks, not because they were fragile, but because they were without context yet, and get overwhelmed by a world that suddenly hisses. Somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd pen of the morning, the bank called. I don't get offended by phones. They are tools like shovels, but I have a special dislike for calls that arrive in a tone. This one had it. Mrs. Harper? The voice said, because even in rural counties, if you owe a bank, they like to use your last name, whether or not you are old enough to have a last name required. Just checking in on that balloon payment. I tucked the phone under my ear and kept tying twine to the fence the way you tie a shoe you plan to walk out in. We're in a weather emergency, I said. Can you call next week? Our system flags, he said. If we don't note the account, the system will advance the file. I looked out across our life. Cattle pushed by courage instead of fear, horses showing us what partnership looks like when it's too cold to be polite, neighbors whose breath made small clouds of honesty. And I said, note it, the account has more important work than your system this morning. He huffed. Clay took the phone. We're good for it, he said, and his voice has a way of making men who sit at desks remember that the world also sits on fence posts. But if you need a payment right now, we can pay you in beef and gratitude, or you can wait a week and get the currency you prefer. To his credit, the banker laughed, maybe for the first time that day, and said he'd note the account. Sometimes dignity asks for nothing but a week. By 10, the sun found its friendliest angle, low and almost kind, and a little steam came off the horse's shoulders like a benediction. June rode by me and lobbed a neck gaiter from the box into my lap. "Put this on, May," she said. "We women have to take care of our throats. It's where the good words live." I slipped it up and felt immediately less mortal. We broke for coffee at 11 because human engines require fuel. I lined mugs on the tailgate and poured while people took their turn in a line that looked accidental, but was, I know now, deliberate. Kids first, old men first, anyone with a cough first. Pastor said a fast grace with no adjectives. Ulmer handed me a biscuit from her own stash and said, "For your pocket later." In return, I slipped her a honey jar, the way women pass strength along discreetly, like medicine. Then back to pushing, back to cutting ice, back to checking floats, back to seeing that one cow, 572, who's been getting away with mischief for 3 winters, eyeing the gap under the cedar. Lila saw it too, and sat her horse right where the idea would die. I approved of her. Ideas are fine in June. In November, you need agreements. By mid-afternoon, clouds stacked like warning signs to the west, and the light went pewter. "Here she comes," Frank said, and everyone pulled their scarves a little higher. We made a last sweep of the east pasture to check for anyone who'd refused the gospel. Found 2 calves and a stubborn old gal behind a tangle of salt cedar. Sage and one of the deacons moved like chess pieces until the situation was solved without declaring a winner. We put the last of the flake trail down. We closed the last gate we needed and opened the ones that should never have been shut. We set a lantern by the south tank, because sometimes light is as much a tool as a saw. When the snow started earnest at 4, we were ready. Not completely, life never gives that, but enough. That is all anyone can ask of a day. Enough. People peeled off in order of responsibility and distance. The kids went first, cheeks burned in the good way. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper!" one of them yelled, misnaming me in a way that warmed me anyway. The retired sheriff tipped his hat like we were on some old movie set and refused my offer of chili because he had a grandbaby to meet at a school play still somehow happening. The deacons shook Clay's hand the way men of faith do when work and belief have been busy in the same room. Mr. Salas tucked a bag of pintos on my tailgate, for later, and scolded me for letting the beans get cold. Frank stayed, because Frank always stays. The tribal riders rode up to me, each took my hand in theirs and said only, "Good water." It meant more than I can tell here, without borrowing a language not mine. I nodded and said, "Good work." It meant, I hope, what they needed it to. Alma and June lingered last. Alma leaned against her trailer and adjusted Pepita's halter like a woman easing her own mind. "You thought that rim was small," she said. "It wasn't. It was a bridge." "Most small things are bridges," I said. "We just call them thanks to keep them light enough to carry." June put her hands on her hips and surveyed the horizon, which had decided to be white and coy. "Consider yourself covered, May," she said. "Next drought, next fire, next calf that won't suck will show up uninvited again. We like the look on your face when we do." "What look is that?" I asked, because curiosity is how I love people best. "The one that says, 'I'm not alone,' and also the one that says, 'I should have made more chili.'" I laughed and promised a second pot. They pulled out, taillights winking like a punctuation mark that means to be continued. Inside, the house smelled like heat and stew and wool. Clay came in last, stamped snow off his boots, and stood just inside the door, like a man consulting gratitude and choosing to say it aloud. "We owe," he started, and I put my finger up. "No," I said. "We receive. Owing is for banks. This is for the ledger they don't keep." He nodded. He is a man acquainted with both ledgers and the dangerous belief that everything can be counted. We learned the difference early in our marriage and never forgot. We sat down at the table with bowls that steamed and silence that wasn't awkward. After a while he said, "You think the banker'll ever understand this economy?" "Maybe," I said, "if he ever needs it." We clinked spoons, a ceremony of 2. Outside, wind tested our work and found it good enough. Cattle settled into their hum. Somewhere in the dark, a gate creaked and then remembered its manners. I thought of the wheel rim, of the old gelding, of Mr. Salas's pump, of June's pride and predicament, of Alma's careful eyes. I thought of how many small yeses a winter asks of a couple, and how much stronger they are when you borrow other people's yeses and give yours back with interest. If you need a moral, I don't have a fancy one. I have only this. He thought it was a small kindness. He didn't think it would come back at sunrise like a cavalry that belonged to nobody and everybody. But it did. Because in a place like this, kindness circulates under the ground like water. On the right morning, it breaks the surface and runs. And if you're lucky enough to be standing in its way, you get to drink.